Friends, last week I did an introductory sermon to a new sermon series on the parable of the prodigal son. And as an aid to exploring this parable, I'd said that I would be using a book written by Henry Nouwen called The Return of the Prodigal Son. And that book is, in fact, a reflection on Rembrandt van Rijn's painting by the same name. A painting that Rembrandt painted very near to the end of his own turbulent and tumultuous life. As I shared last week, the painting by Rembrandt is a beautiful and moving depiction of the moment that the prodigal son meets and is embraced by his father when he returns home. The kneeling son rests his face onto the father's chest as the elderly and partially blind father places his hands gently over the son's shoulders and receives the lost son with warmth and tender love back to himself. There's a beautiful stillness to the painting, almost as though Rembrandt has captured a moment of eternity on canvas. Quite a number of years earlier, Rembrandt had attempted an earlier depiction of the same parable, and it had a lot more sense of dynamism and movement. The earlier painting depicted the moment again of meeting, but this time from a different angle, capturing a sense of the father having run from the one side of the picture to meet the son who had run from the other, who is now depicted half collapsing in a kneeling position before the father. But as I said, his final version of the painting has a serenity and a stillness to it, which captures a sense of something eternal. Rembrandt's final version of the painting reveals also how by the end of his life, an inner transformation had taken place, with a deep sense of having developed a greater inner vision and spiritual insight than he ever did in his younger years. Henry Nouwen writes that in Rembrandt's younger years, Rembrandt had all the characteristics of the prodigal son. He was brash, self-confident, spendthrift, sensual, and very arrogant. Henry Nouwen writes that at the age of 30, Rembrandt had in fact painted himself as the lost son in a brothel, with his wife Saskia painted as one of the young ladies of the brothel. Rembrandt painted himself with his mouth half open, with lustful eyes, holding up a half-empty glass in his one hand, while with his left hand he touches the lower back of the girl in the brothel, who appears perhaps to be seated on his lap. It's a portrait of merriment and sensuousness that perhaps captured something of the character of Rembrandt in his younger years. Henry Nouwen writes that all of Rembrandt's biographers describe him as a proud young man, strongly convinced of his own genius and eager to explore everything that this world has to offer. He was an extrovert who loved luxury and was quite insensitive towards those around him. In addition, like the younger son in the parable, one of Rembrandt's main concerns was money. Rembrandt made a lot, he spent a lot, and he also lost a lot. Nouwen writes that a large part of Rembrandt's energy was wasted in long, drawn-out court cases about financial settlements and bankruptcy proceedings. Henry Nouwen writes that other self-portraits of this period reveal Rembrandt as a man hungry for fame and adulation, fond of extravagant costumes, preferring golden chains to the traditional starched white collars, and sporting outlandish hats, berets, helmets, and turbans. After Rembrandt's short period of success, popularity, and wealth as an artist, what followed was a period of much grief, misfortune, and disaster. He lost 3 children over a 5-year period from 1635 to 1640, and 2 years later his beloved wife Saskia died in 1642. After her death, he had an affair with a woman he had hired to look after his 9-month-old son Titus, an affair which ended in disaster. After this disastrous period of his life, he had a more stable union with another woman, Hendrikia Stoffels, who bore him a son who also died in 1652, and then a daughter, Cornelia. Henry Nouwen writes that during these years, Rembrandt's popularity as a painter plummeted, and in 1656, Rembrandt was declared insolvent, having to sign over all of his property and effects for the benefit of his creditors in order to avoid complete bankruptcy. In doing so, he lost all of his possessions, all of his own paintings, as well as his collection of other painters' works, his large collection of artifacts, and his house in Amsterdam with all its furniture. When Rembrandt died in 1669, he had become a poor and a lonely man. Only his daughter Cornelia, his daughter-in-law Magdalene van Leeuwen, and his granddaughter Titia survived him. His common-law wife, Hendrikia, had already died 6 years earlier, and his son Titus had died just a year before his own death. And yet, rather than becoming bitter and twisted by this tumultuous life, rather than wallowing in his own pain and self-pity, this life of excess leading to disaster and loss seemed to have a purifying effect on Rembrandt. In a way, his life of ruin and loss led him in a movement away from the glory of the world that seduces with all its glittering lights, to a discovery of the inner light of old age, the glory that is hidden in the human soul which surpasses death. While his own story had begun in excess and waste, like the prodigal, in a very profound way, it was that very journey that led him to the inner light of God's grace and compassion, that is so profoundly expressed in this painting of the return of the prodigal son. In a way, by the end of his turbulent life, Rembrandt had indeed become the prodigal who had now returned home, or was ready to return home to God. In a very real sense, the prodigal son depicted kneeling before his father is a depiction of Rembrandt himself. It was he who had learned by the end of his life how to kneel before God who had made him and who loved him. It was he whose pride and brashness had been transformed into humility and surrender before the tender love of the divine. But in another sense, Henry Nouwen suggests that Rembrandt was not only the younger son in this painting returning home to the father. In a very real sense, by the end of his life, the aged Rembrandt had indeed grown also to become the gentle, welcoming, tender father depicted in the painting. The only reason that Rembrandt could paint the gentle embrace of the father was because that gentle wisdom and compassion of the father had begun to dwell within himself as well. Henry Nouwen writes, one must have died many deaths and cried many tears to have painted a portrait of God in such humility. At the end of his life, Rembrandt was indeed the prodigal who had begun to find his way home to God. But in another sense, the gentle, loving, and welcoming Father had come to dwell within the sanctuary of his own heart. Now, the journey of the Protestant Reformed painter Rembrandt van Rijn, from being the prodigal son in his youth to becoming the father in the parable by the end of his life, is in a different way paralleled in the life of the Dutch Catholic priest Henry Nouwen, whose life had become so deeply affected by Rembrandt's painting. As I shared in last week's sermon, when Henry Nouwen had first encountered the painting, it was the prodigal son that had so captivated his attention. He had realized that he was that son. He was looking for a place that he could call home. He was the one who felt lost and longed to be embraced. But a few years later, while discussing the same painting with a trusted friend in England, his friend had looked quite intently at Henry and said, "I wonder if you are not more like the older son." And with those words, his friend had opened up a whole new space within him. He had never thought of himself as the older son. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that that was indeed who he was. He had always lived quite a dutiful life, just like the older son. When he was 6 years old, he had already wanted to become a priest. He was born, baptized, confirmed, and ordained in the same church. He had always been obedient to his parents, his teachers, his bishops, and indeed to God. He had never truly run away from home, and had never wasted his time and money on sensual pursuits. He had never gotten lost in debauchery and drunkenness. For his entire life, he had been quite responsible, traditional, homebound. And yet for all that, he may well have been just as lost as the younger son in the story, as he began to see himself in a whole new way. He writes, "I saw my jealousy, my anger, my touchiness, doggedness and sullenness, and most of all my subtle self-righteousness. I saw how much of a complainer I was, and how much of my thinking and feeling was ridden with resentment. I was the elder son for sure," he writes, "but I was just as lost as the younger brother. I had been working very hard on my father's farm, but had never fully tasted the joy of being at home." And so, having first identified himself with the younger son in the painting, and then discovered that he was the elder son for sure, a few years later he became challenged by another trusted friend, who again, when reflecting on the painting, asked him, or said to him, "Whether you are the younger son or the older son, you have to realize that you are called to become the father. You have been looking for friends all your life. You've been craving for affection as long as I've known you," the friend said. "You have been interested in 1,000 things. You have been begging for attention, appreciation, affirmation, left and right. The time has come," said the friend, "to claim your true vocation, to be a father who can welcome his children home without asking them any questions and without wanting anything from them in return." In writing his book on the return of the prodigal son, a few years after this conversation, Henry Nouwen writes, "I still feel the desire to remain the son and never grow old. But I've come also to know in a small way what it means to be a father who asks no questions, wanting only to welcome his children home." Over the next few weeks, as we continue with this parable, may we also discover within ourselves not only the lost children of God, but may we also discover the compassionate mother and father within, that is God. Amen.